Okay, so let's go ahead. No, I think we have today Martin Rama. So it's everybody. Yeah, I assume everybody's comfortable with English these days. So Martin is the chief economist for the World Bank for the Latin America and Caribbean region. Very experienced economist. What can I say? And I think it's a complete privilege to have him today to present this report that is part of the semi-annual series of analysis that the World Bank does for the region. This one obviously could not be missed. Is about the pandemic, the recovery, the impact from various perspectives. So without further ado, what I can do is give the floor to Martin, and then if you agree, we can have a conversation. I think that's probably the easier part about, a few questions that you may have, a few visions that Martin may have, and exchange a few views that probably, what is in there that is more relevant to Brazil, which I think is probably the most relevant part of this conversation. Okay, so Martin, without further ado, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rafa, and thank you all for the interest for being here. As Rafa said, at the World Bank, we publish twice a year an update on where the region stands. That's in April and in October, so a few weeks ago, the last one. And as it could not be otherwise, the last two reports have been very much around COVID and the impact of COVID. And so what I will do is I will try not to take too long so that we can have a conversation if you have questions. The report is a report for a broad audience. So it's a report for policymakers, for opinion makers. But behind the report, there is academic work of the sort that the attendance to a meeting like this may be interested in. There are 5 background papers that are in different phases of finalization and will be available in our website at the World Bank, like everything can be downloaded. I can tell you more about them, but I will be, given the audience here more technical, I will also be saying a few more words than I will otherwise about those background papers. So let me share my screen with you. I hope it's coming. And let me put it in full screen mode, if this accepts. So this is the report, This is the report that we launched in October. It is available at the link you have there. There is a Portuguese version and a Spanish version too of it. And the title refers to 2 dimensions of the cost of staying healthy that we try to combine in one report. One is from an economic point of view. This is a pandemic that we had to fight with measures that had a clear economic impact. And so the question is how severe the cost was of trying to protect the population and how we can manage it and manage it better if possible. The second is a reflection on the cost of health in general. I think this pandemic has been a test of healthcare systems across the region. Many governments are thinking how to improve on coverage, quality, how to access vaccines, at which price. And so we go into something very specific, which is the price of medicines, which is one of the most important items in healthcare in the region. So it's the cost of staying healthy in both ways, economic cost, but also the cost of health itself. This COVID crisis is, of course, one of the worst we have had, and this in a region that has had no shortage of crisis. So when we say it's one of the worst, it means something. But I would like to emphasize that if we were just able to go back to January or February of last year, that will not be enough to be cheerful, because the region was not going through a very good patch economically. After the decade of high commodity prices, natural resources, where the region grew exceptionally well, poverty fell, inequality fell, we have had many years now of very low growth. On average for the region, something similar to an advanced economy, so no convergence. And we have had a stagnation in the social indicators. And over the last year, 2019, we had many episodes of social unrest in the region, about a dozen important episodes of social unrest for a region that has 30 countries. So all that shows that even if there was no COVID, we will have issues to worry about, and I will come back to them at the end. But now, in addition, we have COVID. When we put out our report in April, the forecasts were extremely negative. There was a lot of uncertainty, and there were very bad news coming every week on what was going on. Since then, there have been some, I would say, good surprises. Let me skip this slide. And the good surprises have been on three fronts, some of which are more relevant for Brazil and some less. The first one is trade. There was a collapse in trade at the beginning, but trade in goods has held relatively well. Not trade in services, not tourism, which has gone down a lot, but trade in goods is basically back to where it was before the crisis. And in a surprising twist of events, despite all the trade tensions, the share of China in global trade has increased, not decreased, because that's a region of the world that bounced back the most, that has been the supplier of all the things that we are buying through Amazon and through other platforms, electronic platforms. And that, for a country like Brazil, is very important news. The other two relatively good news we have had, one is on the financial markets. In the first 5-6 weeks after the outbreak of COVID, we got capital outflows, short-term capital outflows, that were bigger than everything that we saw together during the global financial crisis. So there was a fear that countries will be cut off from financial markets, and that will make the adjustment more painful. That didn't happen. The region has issued more bonds in international markets now than it did in the entire 2019, and at lower rates. So that has given some room for fiscal response. And the third good news, which is less important for Brazil, but let me point it out because it's an interesting one, is that remittances held much better than expected. In around May at the World Bank, we put a report out with a forecast of remittances falling to by 19% or something like that. It has not happened. In fact, for most of the countries, there is an increase. And if you want, we can discuss what are the hypotheses behind that increase. But for many countries in the region, Haiti, Jamaica, El Salvador, Honduras, Mexico, this is very important news. The other element I want to highlight is that despite the limited fiscal space, which was one of the constraints of the region, a strong policy response was put in place. The fiscal space was highly constrained in cases like Brazil, not to mention Argentina or Ecuador. The only countries that seemed to have some room at the time were Peru first, Chile, Colombia. And so one of the concerns, while advanced economies were going into do whatever it takes, is that in our region, we could not do whatever it takes. We can only do whatever we could. And yet, in spite of that, the size of the stimulus packages was huge, in particular in Brazil, but not only in Brazil, Colombia and others. Of course, measuring the stimulus package overall is difficult. This is our estimate. The IMF has slightly different estimates. There are measures that are off budget. There are things that go through taxes and so on and so forth. But you have, in general, a response that is on average about 5% of GDP, so very substantial, and even more in cases like Brazil. And yet, and this is the topic of the report, in spite of all this, we are having a huge crisis. In spite of having reacted very early with the containment measures in most of the countries. Countries were watching what was happening in Spain, what was happening in Italy. Quarantines were put in place within a couple of weeks of the first case in most of Latin America, and yet we end up with a region that has among the worst health outcomes and the worst economic outcomes of all. The social damage has been huge. Here are the results of a series of telephone surveys we have conducted at the World Bank, about 13 countries, I believe, in 3 rounds, starting shortly after the pandemic outbreak. In the left panel, you see what happened to jobs. So it's the percentage of adults that report unemployment loss. And you see in the blue bars is the first wave that in general, about 15–20% of adults lost some form of employment. The right panel is even more impressive because it looks similar, but the scale is completely different. and that's the households that report a loss of income. And in many cases, you have, for instance, farmers, people working in the informal sector. They don't lose their jobs, they are self-employed, but there is nothing that they can do in terms of income. There is also concern about the impact on firms. This is a similar survey, telephone survey, that the bank conducted in 45 countries. Here there are the results for the country in Latin America, and for Brazil, we don't have the data for the right panel. The left panel is the reported change in sales in the firms interviewed, about 40–50% decline in sales. The right panel, which is the one concerning for financial stability, is the percentage of firms that declare that they are already in arrears or expect to be in arrears in the next 6 months. And again, we are talking about 40 or 50%. And so with all this panorama, the question is, what can we expect in the region? Well, as I said, one of the good news was the size of the stimulus package, and perhaps very important is the part that went to social transfers. In a way, governments have had to handle what to do. All of them did something on healthcare, and that's the orange part. It's the share of the fiscal stimulus that went into health, buying ventilators, building hospitals, running campaigns, procuring kits for testing and all that. But then the big debate was how much to support firms and how much to support households. And in the advanced economies, we have had a bit of that debate. Europe has gone massively into protecting jobs. The US has gone more into protecting workers. Latin America has gone more in the direction of protecting workers. If you look at the dark part is the social transfers, that in some cases, in fact, in terms of size, 5 of the largest programs to support households in the world by number of beneficiaries were in our region. And the one in Brazil was extraordinarily strong. Now, why does this matter? And here I'm coming to the first background paper of this report, which is how multipliers for this fiscal spending work. This is a study from our macro team working on a flagship on fiscal policies that will come up next year in 2021. And you see across countries on the left panel what we expect typically from multipliers in advanced economies, about 0.2, 0.3% increase in economic activity for a $1 of extra stimulus. On the right panel, you have our estimates for Latin America. And there is a difference of almost 1 order of magnitude, much closer to 1-to-1 in the context of a recession. And we try to explore why this is so. And the right panel is the result of a Keynesian model, neo-Keynesian model, that has 2 types of agents. Agents that are financially constrained, that live from hand to mouth, and agents that are not. The ones that are financially constrained, they really need the transfers, the corona vouchers, or whatever it is, and they go and spend it. So what we did was to simulate country by country how much was spent on social transfers and how well targeted was it. So how much of the social transfers went to hand-to-mouth households and how much went to households that were constrained. And because the packages were big and in some cases were relatively well targeted, we get again through simulations multipliers that are commensurate with the idea of a very strong response. In spite of that, there were the containment measures. Let me get to that. So we had months anyway of activity going down. Not in all countries, not to the same extent, even within countries like Brazil, to different extents in different parts of the countries. But we had that supply shock that was very strong and is very difficult to offset just with demand. And that creates a lot of uncertainty. One of the problems we face in assessing the situation is how much do we trust our macro forecasts? Because our macro forecasts are basically the result of some VAR model that we estimated in previous years. But we never had a situation where we had a demand shock and a supply shock at the same time. And so we saw in this uncertainty, we saw a lot of time when around April, every forecast was being more pessimistic than the other. Now we seem to be in the opposite direction, like every forecast is a bit less dark than the other. And the question is, where do we stand? And here I want to show the results of a second background paper, which is already almost ready for dissemination, on where we have been doing at my office on using big data to try to assess the economic situation. And what we focus on, there is on emissions of nitrogen dioxide. Nitrogen dioxide is what comes out of the exhausts of vehicles, what comes out of the chimneys of factories, of burning. So it's very much related to economic activity. It has one big advantage to work on something we are planning to do, which is to go much more granular, is that NO2 does not go far away with the wind. So you don't need a complex model to try to figure out when you see NO2 emissions, where they are coming from. They're basically coming from where they happen. And there is a NASA satellite that captures this information around the world 24 hours. Every 24 hours releases a full map. Of course, the data cannot be used without some cleaning. For instance, you see in the maps that Canada, Russia are in gray because as you get close to the Arctic, the data is not as reliable. But we do have data for every country, every day, of NO2 emissions. Now, the question is, that is not necessarily economic activity, because the relationship between economic activity and emissions varies depending on the type of country. If you have heavy manufacturing, heavy industry, coal-generated energy, probably you have a lot of emissions. If you are a country that does tourism and finance, probably you have smaller emissions. So we had to estimate country by country the elasticity of emissions to GDP, so that by looking at emissions, we could work it back and backward and get the GDP. This table is already with the correction for GDP. This map, the top panel is the second quarter of this year compared to the second quarter of 2019. The bottom panel is the third quarter of this year compared to the third quarter of last year. Colors in red means decline. Shades of blue mean increase. So you see that in the second quarter of 2020, everybody was more or less in the red, very seriously in the red in Europe, in Western Europe, but also in the Americas to a large extent. By the third quarter, East Asia was already growing. And Latin America was not in as negative a situation. Now, what is interesting, and we will see what comes out when the final figures are out, is that if we use this information to estimate how severe the decline of GDP is in Latin America, we get a decline that is less than what we get from our macro models. And so one of the questions is, which one shall we trust going forward? One of the things that this crisis has taught us is the importance of digitization, including perhaps for the way we are measuring economic activity. Now, let me turn to not just the economic activity, but the combination of economic activity and health cost. And let me tell you about a third background paper that we did for this report that tried to, the implicit question is, should the policy choices in relation to the pandemic be the same in rich and poor countries? Should we apply the same recipe everywhere? Which is what we did. Basically, in March, April, we did the same as Western Europe was doing in general, not every country, but or not every state, but that's what we did. So here what we do is we take 51 countries in the world, and all, not just Latin America and the Caribbean, all levels of development for which we do have good data, and we measure how many deaths per million people from COVID. So the horizontal axis is how many deaths, and we have 6 months of observations, is how many days since the first COVID case in the country. The vertical axis is how many deaths per million people. And then we estimate the dynamic of the deaths depending on the type of containment measures there are, like no containment measures, partial, or targeted, or general. And we use a structure that is very rich in terms of fixed effects by country, level, progression. So we don't know why countries are different, but for each of our countries, we can retrieve something that says this country is different from the trend in this way or that way. Here, what I represent in this figure is 2 of our 51 countries. The one in blue is always the one at the 75th percentile in terms of income per capita. So you can think of it as a rich country. The one in red is one at the 25th percentile, so a poor country, perhaps a Latin American country. The solid lines tell you, once we have our estimates, what we predict will happen with the deaths if nothing is done. No targeted measure, no general quarantine. And you see that in all cases, there is a rapid progression in the number of deaths, but the progression is much faster in the rich country. So why this could be? One obvious reason is measurement. In poor countries, you don't know very well how many people die, or it takes time. You need censuses to really get the data. You don't know very well what people die of. So this measurement, this difference may simply reflect the fact that we know better in advanced economies. But there is a suspicion that it could be related to the fact that poor countries tend to be more rural. In rural areas, you have social distancing no matter what. You don't need to engineer it through policies. They are younger and younger populations. These are diseases that have been very severe on older people. So what we do in a second phase of the paper is to retrieve these fixed effects and to regress them on this type of characteristics: urbanization rate, age, air pollution, and we find basically what you would expect in terms of correlation. But then the second interesting thing is the dotted lines. The dotted lines are a simulation of putting a general quarantine on day 15 after the beginning of, after the first outbreak. And you see that quarantines are very effective in advanced economies. Basically, after 2 months, you have half of the deaths you will have otherwise experienced. They are somewhat effective in the poor country, but not to the same extent. And again, one can speculate as to why this is so. For instance, it could well be that quarantines are much more difficult to enforce in countries that are poor or informal. It could well be that quarantining people, blocking down people in slums where there is overcrowding and no water, no sanitation. Basically, what you make sure is that everybody gets the disease as opposed to preventing the spread. But again, the model is agnostic. It just tells us what it is. But this raises the question as to whether the containment measures should be the same. And I think this is a question, as we are approaching, in some cases, a second wave. This is a question that many governments are struggling with. Let me skip this and tell you then, beyond the debate as to what is more effective, what happened in practice. And so we try to summarize, think of a frontier of possibilities for the policymaker, where you're basically navigating between economic costs and health costs. Where are the countries in our region here in this frontier? How many of them are the frontier? How many of them are below the frontier? Because what you don't want to do is to have, regardless of what your choice is, regardless of what your preferences are between economic activity and health lives that are lost, is you don't want to have more than could be accomplished. So in this figure, in the horizontal axis, you have the number of deaths per million as of early October. On the right, 0 means nobody died from COVID. On the left, 1,000 means 1 person every 1,000 died of COVID in this month. And on the vertical axis, you have GDP impact. Now here we measure, we use our models. We compare what our forecast for 2020 was in January with what our forecast for 2020 is now. And so we say, well, there may be other things, but we say this mainly COVID. And you see that there is a very diverse range of situations in Latin America. At one end, with relatively low cost, and let me emphasize relative, because we are talking about 6 points less of growth than was anticipated. You have countries like Uruguay, Paraguay, even Guatemala, Costa Rica to some extent. So these are the countries in the region that contain the cost most. Then you have on the right, the Caribbean countries. The Caribbean countries in general did well in terms of saving lives, but because they are so dependent on tourism, and tourism is a sector that was most dramatically affected by the pandemic, they had catastrophic declines. Even we have other countries that I don't show in the figure that are below -16. On the other side, we have countries like Brazil. Brazil had a very heavy cost in terms of lives, but it had, for a variety of reasons, including the bounce back of China, it has an impact that is not so negative, terribly negative, but not so negative compared to the others. And then you have the worst cases, which are the Andean countries, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, but also Mexico and Panama. So we have a very diverse set of situations. And one of the questions is, can we try to learn from each other on what worked in some countries and what didn't work in some others? Let me go to the other dimension of the cost of staying healthy, which is healthcare costs. Healthcare costs in general, so now we are not talking about year of pandemic, we are talking in general, is a major driver of government spending. Here you have this from data from the WHO. You have how much is spent on health in each of the countries. You see that Brazil is close to 10%. In Brazil, the mix is about half is paid by households, half is paid by the public sector. For some countries like Haiti, you have trust funds, you have donors that are covering part of the expenses, Honduras. But you see that in general, something like 5% of GDP goes into health expenditure. And when it comes to households, we processed household surveys for household expenditure surveys for 8 countries in the region where we could have a disaggregation of expenditures. And you see that for all households in the left, regardless of the decile from poorest to richest, households are spending from 3 to 7 or 8% of their consumption on health. And that is very concentrated in a few households that tend to spend more. In health, you have this situation where when you have a catastrophic shock in particular, expenses become very high. So in general, the lines on the right are higher than the ones on the left. But what is striking, if you look within those expenses, what are they? And they are mainly pharmaceuticals. And so these are medicines. And when you look at the households that get a positive spending, so the ones that are hit by disease, you see that first figures are substantial. Again, we are talking about 2 to 8% of all expenditures, and they are regressive. With few exceptions, they tend to be regressive. For the poor deciles, the spending is much more than for the rich. And so the question we ask ourselves is, so what is it about the price or the policies on medicines, on pharmaceuticals in the region? Pharmaceuticals are a very important part of trade. Here, this figure shows imports of pharmaceuticals and medical supplies. Here, pharmaceuticals also include veterinarian pharmaceuticals, but if you do it with just for human use, you still get about 10 to 15% of imports often are related to that. And they are mainly for domestic use. You see that the exports of pharmaceuticals, except for Dominican Republic and for Costa Rica, which exports supplies, medical equipment, toolkits, and things like that. This is mainly for domestic market. And pharmaceuticals can be classified in 3 areas. And here I'm talking about a fourth background paper that we did for this report, which is about the pharmaceutical sector in Latin America, which we find at a time when discussions with the vaccine and all that are coming in line, highly relevant. And there are 3 types of pharmaceuticals. 2 are easy to understand. One is generics. Every country has a generics policy, which means these are simple molecules, think ibuprofen or things like that, that are very standard, and every country has a policy to make them accessible. So that's the blue. This figure, we built it, we bought the databases of private pharmacies in several countries in Latin America, tells you of the packages that go over the counter in pharmacies, how many are generic. And you see that some countries have very little, Argentina, both in volume or value. Some have much more, like Chile or Colombia. At the other end, in gray, are the branded products. These tend to be complex medicines, biological medicines, not chemical, but biological. For example, think of the medicines for cancer treatment. They are protected by patents, intellectual property rights. If you were to do this figure for the US or for Europe, you will see the blue color and the gray color. You will not see much of this orange color. This orange color happens in Latin America. And these are products that are local, that are very similar to the branded products, but are developed locally. And what happens with many of these biological medicines is that they are a bit like wines. Not 2 bottles of wine are identical. And so you have many, you already have enough capacity in Latin America, substantial capacity, to really do the research and the trials and all that. And some countries are strong. Brazil is one of them. Argentina is strong. Cuba is very strong in these things. But depending on the regime of intellectual property rights and trade agreements that the country has, the laboratory can say, oh, this is not exactly the same as the imported one, because I did my own research, I did my own trial, so I know this is my thing. And so we have all this range in orange that corresponds to that type of medicine. Now, these medicines have very different prices. Here's again a price per package. And you look at a country like Argentina, and you see that the gradient is not very high. Basically, branded products are not so expensive, generic products are quite expensive, and the others in between. You look at a country like Chile, and you see the huge difference. Chile or Peru, which have very strong policy of competition in generics, have very cheap generics, but then very expensive branded products, especially because these are countries that have signed very strong trade agreements with the protection of intellectual property rights. But these medicines tend to be very expensive for a household. So if you remember, I started with the social unrest. Remember, the social unrest in Chile was one of the strongest. At that time of the social unrest, people in the riots were setting metro stations ablaze, but also pharmacies. And there was something about why pharmacies, and you can get a sense here why. So what we asked in this report, and this is the fifth and last working paper, which is almost ready also, is to ask how come we have these differences of prices. And it turns out that the biggest purchaser of medicines in any country is the government. Even if you go and buy through the pharmacy, a lot of purchases come through government procurement. And because e-procurement has progressed a lot in the region, we could retrieve the micro data from e-procurement from 7 countries, including Brazil. And in the case of Brazil, we could even get 2 states. So we have the federal government, Amazonas, and Santa Catarina. So we have 9 jurisdictions, and we have 500,000 transactions. We are talking big data. 500,000 transactions of purchasing of medicines. And we could, with a big data scientist, basically standardize, we managed to standardize 235 medicines, like ibuprofen, as I said, and to ask how much did the government pay for a pill of ibuprofen in different countries. And there, very interesting things come. First thing is not in this figure. Let me come to this figure in a moment. Within a country, what we look is for each of these medicines, the price for the purchase at the 25th percentile, the price for the purchase at the 75th percentile. We didn't go to the full tail. So we're saying, well, government buys hundreds of times in different procurement packages. And what we find is that for the same medicine, again, let me say ibuprofen, you can have a difference of, say, 40% between the 25th and 75th percentile. And you may say, well, 40% is not too bad, it's variation in supply conditions. But sometimes it's 10 times, sometimes it's 30 times. And so it turns out that the way the procurement contracts are structured matters a lot. The way the domestic market for pharmaceuticals is structured also matters a lot. So the 5 you have here are in the total of this procurement database that we explored, that had $9 billion in purchases of medicine. So we are not talking small numbers. The top 5 spenders are the ones that you have here. Trastuzumab is one of these branded medicines for breast cancer, treatment of breast cancer. Amoxicillin, the second one, is an antibiotic. Sodium chloride, the third one, is water with salt. So this is not a very sophisticated product, but governments buy tons of water with salt for their hospitals. Fourth one is ibuprofen, a painkiller. And last one, fifth one is clarithromycin, sorry for the pronunciation, another antibiotic. So these 5 are the top spenders, several $100 million of spending in the database. And we just compute the average for each of the jurisdictions in our database. And you see that the differences are huge for very standard products. So in terms when we need to think about where will the savings be, and what is the well-being of the households with health. We thought that this is one area where to think about. This background paper I referred to goes into more depth into other issues because it's an interesting trade-off. These domestic laboratories have been extremely important in building scientific capacity in our countries. The number of publications, the number of patents, the clinical trials have increased a lot. The region has become important, and a lot of the scientific capacity that was used to respond to the COVID crisis comes from here. At the same time, many of them operate a bit like the old import substitution. So they get agreements with governments so that their medicines are purchased and that covers their costs and so on and so forth. So this is a complex subject that we, as economists, sometimes we don't think much about. But how we organize our policies on medicines, the type of alliances that we are seeing now, which are so interesting with the big pharma, the fact that, for instance, now across Latin America, Indian companies, the biggest producers of generics, are settling in. For instance, now in Mexico on a massive scale, because the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement gives them access to the US. So we wanted to put these issues on the table for discussion with this report. These are very short reports. So it's just like browsing an issue and putting it on the table. Let me just use 3 more minutes, and with this I finish, on so what does come out of this. And these are reports that do not make any recommendations. So you will not find anything saying, oh, government should do this or should do that. It's just putting issues on the table for discussion. The first one is the sense that in spite of all the optimism we can have about the vaccine, probably we're not out of the woods yet. It will take time before vaccines are produced and made available in sufficient quantities, that people take them, that we reach the immunity. So if you go back to where we were in March or April of this year, we thought of COVID as a sprint. We go, we quarantine, and by now it's a bit like a marathon. And so the first message is, remember the trade-offs between health costs and economic costs is, we better think like we have 1 or 2 more years to go. You hope for the best, but you plan for the worst. And in particular, it will be difficult to have stimulus packages like the ones we had in 2020 for multiple years. That will become a challenge. Second is related to healthcare. One of the things that comes out from this analysis of household surveys is that systems serve people very differently. There are countries like Brazil that have a very good universal system, Colombia, others not. Most countries in the region have reached the point where we have formal universal coverage in the sense that you go to a public hospital and you get treatment, but the quality of the treatment, the out-of-pocket expenses associated with it are completely different. So we thought, oh, this is a good time to think about the healthcare systems in our countries, especially the ones that had the biggest challenge. Third one, and let me show you a figure on it, is on medicines, the topic I told you. And here we simulated with this database just a better using the results of estimation. Like we try to see when is that governments paid more for the same medicine. How was the procurement, the tender structure, advertisement period, how many products were bundled, and also what was happening in the economy, the number of bidders that we had, the market structure we were operating in. And we find that with changes that are not very substantial, that are more technical changes, one could reduce, for the part that we could really do comparable things, between 12 and 15% pharmaceutical expenses. This may not seem like much, but think that countries spend something like 1% of the GDP or more in pharmaceuticals. So this is not a negligible amount, because what the government does as the main supplier, buyer, cascades throughout the system. Fourth point is informality. I think in general, what we see is that the cost of the COVID crisis was higher in countries with more informality if we measure the cost in what happened to households. And so far, in Latin America, we have tended to live with informality as something that, okay, it's a problem, but is the solution could be worse. But we think is if we were to force informal companies to pay all the taxes and play by all the rules, jobs will suffer a lot. What we saw in this crisis is that informality had a cost, an enormous cost. In the case of Brazil, the fact that there was Bolsa Familia that could be scaled up, that there were registers, helped enormously. But there are countries where, because precisely people are informal, even if you want to help and you want to put a program in practice, it's very difficult to reach out. And here, one of the thoughts, and it will be probably the topic of much research and discussion in the coming years, is whether digitization, which will happen because we will try to work more remotely to reduce distance because there has been so much progress on selling through internet platforms, whether digitization may help us addressing, expand the base of the part that we have information about and reduce the fiscal pressure on that base. Because the problem that Latin America has had is it has a part of the economy that is formal, that is paying for everything that we try to make universal for social reasons. And so as people age, treatments become more expensive, pensions come up, this part is paying more and more, and jobs suffer. Digitization offers the opportunity to rethink even social protection programs. Before, when you had someone in a motorbike delivering things, you knew nothing about this person. Now you know working hours, income, you can use that for social protection systems that are portable. Today, the person is driving a motorbike, tomorrow is doing something else. You can accumulate years of service and years of contribution. So digitization may be a way to rethink formality, and that's our fourth message. Last one is, of course, what to do with fiscal. This figure shows where public debt was in 2017 in the region on the horizontal axis relative to GDP, where we forecast it to be as we enter into 2021. And you see that on average, countries in the region have added 10 points of GDP. Good news again is we can tap financial markets, even countries in crisis with several presidents over a few months like Peru could issue bonds for 100 years, but our countries are not the US and not the EU. We don't have reserve currencies. There is a risk in going into that. And so one of the questions is whether, how much, how to consolidate going forward if we cannot sustain these kind of programs that we had during the pandemic. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Martin, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I mean, it's an impressive presentation. Let me maybe open the floor. I have tons of questions, but obviously I'm gonna refrain, and I'm gonna give the floor of the attendants. So whoever is in there, maybe let's take a couple of 2 or 3 questions to start motivating the discussion. Anybody? If not, I can pose my questions then.
Okay.
Let me start maybe with a few points that I would like to pick your brain. When the pandemic struck, we were lost. I remember the days. I mean, we all remember. We will remember the days. I mean, we were lost. Yeah. And suddenly, 2 messages emerge. Okay, one on the health and the other on the economy. On the health was lockdown. That was the message. Just stay home, flatten the curve. I mean, call it as you wish, but stay home. And the second was do whatever you can. Okay, so fiscal, financial, tax delays, call it as you wish, but put everything. Okay, and this was the policy's advice. Okay? Simple. If we take, for instance, the case of Brazil, which I think is a very good case, they did whatever they can in terms of the economics. I mean, the response was super quick, super big, and I would say fairly well implemented. I mean, because the difficulty of this is not just how you transfer 60 billion reais to the people, and they had the infrastructure. So they have the tools, the institutions, the knowledge to deliver massive assistance to the household in the middle of nowhere. Okay, so I think for the credit of Brazil, they did whatever they can, and they took, I would say, all panoply of programs, from Auxilio Emergencial, which is giving money to the poor and the informal, if we want, to protecting jobs by allowing exceptional labor regulations, paying for reduction in number of hours, etc., etc. So I think it worked very, very well in that sense, okay? And this helped to maintain the economy. The response was less clear in the case of Brazil for the health. Okay, it was more messy, if I might say, you know. Part of it because also the country is organized as a federal country, and therefore there are many actors that participate on this, and not necessarily well aligned. We have seen this in other federal countries. I mean, to me, the US is the other example. You know, lockdowns, but who should be locking down? You know, can we afford everybody to be locking down? You know, not totally clear, and therefore a bit of messy. The question, as you said, is the multipliers were great. And for Brazil, they have been great. I mean, what we have seen is that actually our projections say that poverty in Brazil is going to reduce this year, which could be incredible. I mean, nobody would believe it. So, you know, and the economy is doing well and doing fast. When I take your health costs, and when we take your graph, the cost was enormous. I mean, Brazil paid the price of a health response, you know, messy, let's put it that way. And however, when we look at that photo today, it's even different. You see, the second wave has changed. The lockdown, it's unclear, and more people is coming with this question. Is a bit of what you said is, do we need to go for a risk-based approach on health? Do we need to take a very different approach? I mean, we cannot afford to be locked down forever. And the vaccine is going to be here, but it's not going to be here tomorrow. So between now and then, what do we do? I mean, we try lockdowns. It didn't work, or it worked as much as it could. But so how do we go for that period that we have in front of us until the vaccine? We cannot, certainly, I think in the case of Brazil, afford that massive fiscal program anymore. Quite the contrary, I think the authorities have been clear, we need to consolidate, and therefore we may afford something in the margins. You know, it's expanding a little bit Bolsa Familia to collect a few more people, but that's it. We have exhausted that. Is the solution on that risk-based approach on the health? What's your sense from the different countries?
Yeah, it's different for us to answer, but as economists, I would say, back in March or April of this year, I think the mere thought of handing a trade-off between lives and livelihoods was politically very difficult. It was considered unacceptable. So as economists, we did something that we will not recommend. We solved one problem first and then got the solution for the other one conditional on the first one. As economists, we would say this is a simultaneous optimization program. Let's be consistent with what we do on road safety, on some other things that involve an economic cost and a life cost. And let's try to do that. At that point, it was impossible. In the same way as today, it is impossible to do the opposite. I think today, any government that says we will go into lockdown runs the risk of just being kicked out. So we have a political constraint that works in one direction in one case, in another direction in another case. But I think what we have learned is that risk and cost are very different for different sectors, for different people. Like, you don't want to, even if you go into lockdown and you depend on mining, you may not want to close your mines. They are your source of revenue, and people may be quite distant anyway. So which activities you are targeting makes a difference. Which population segments? We know by now that everyone who is relatively healthy and below 65 has relatively low risk of dying from COVID, and it becomes very serious after that. And so the idea that we don't go anymore for general measures and that we are much more targeted I think is a first idea. And in that respect, if you look at these big federal countries like the US or Brazil, in the end, the fact that it was so diverse might have been a good thing, because you probably went into more severe lockdowns where you had the medical capacity, the higher urbanization, all the things. In a way, it was the revealed preferences of which way we go. And in a place where you had a lot of informality and people were young and wanted to go out, you just got what you got. I think so. To me, the first point is the political constraint is different. Second, from a technical point of view, I think something that is targeted, even it can be a city, can be a neighborhood, will be much better if we have that capacity. Of course, after the epidemic has reached some level, just tracing doesn't work. If you take now in advanced economies, if you do the tracing, you can trace that you got it from someone in your family, but you cannot trace farther out. So the tracing is, in my own country, Uruguay, may be at the edge between still being successful at containing and losing it. But the third point I would like to make, after the first one, the political, the second one, the important target, is that we need to approach this from a welfare economics perspective. We have been asking people to make changes in their lives that have had very differentiated impacts. You are a health worker, and we told the health workers, go and fight for all of us. And they run a huge risk. And we applaud them and all that, but it was a huge risk for them. You would say from an economic perspective, these people should have been receiving incentives, compensation. And same thing for the ones that are locked in. If you say, oh, I have old parents, I need to stay at home. Well, that's the kind of person where you say, well, if you have to take care of old parents, let's cover your income so that you don't need to get out, because you are handling a big risk. So instead of going through these quantity measures, thinking how we use the monetary measures in a way that achieves some, I will not call it indifference, because we cannot be indifferent to COVID, but something that is fair in some sense, and that we don't waste the scarce resources we have to keep indoors people who are young, who can work, who do not have old relatives. I think that's the way we should be going in the coming months.
Excellent. I see here one question by Raquel Lesa, who asks, Martin, did you analyze disaggregated mental health expenditures during this pandemic?
I saw the question is a very good question, and unfortunately not. We don't have responses, but I think there start to be interesting studies on how this has affected from the kind of cabin fever of being locked down to deeper depression. I think it's one of the costs. There are many costs that for us economists, we tend to think of GDP and we tend to think of death, as I had in, but the cost in terms of social life. In fact, if young people are behaving in ways that older people like me may sometimes consider very inappropriate, is that for them, the sacrifice of a year without social life is too big. And that's a legitimate concern. But we are not good at measuring these non-monetary outcomes of and so for now, I've seen studies, but we have not done anything in our office.
Thank you. And I think we have a question by Apiyas Pons about lockdowns are more effective in richer countries. The difference between the no action and the general measure do show bigger difference in richer countries. However, the richer countries also face with much higher debt since the beginning. Have you come across to analyze the reasons for this as well?
I think it's a very good question. And the answer is, unfortunately, from a statistical point of view, with 51 countries, it's very difficult to try to get to the correlates. Of course, you may say, oh, this is the reason why I think, and you may say it's because of urbanization, averages, and we may all agree on that. But then you start adding air pollution, the winds, the season, the temperature, and you very rapidly run out of degrees of freedom. And what I have found remarkable is that there has been this kind of study in different ways for counties in the US. And there you have many observations, because you have whatever 3,800 counties. And there is very, very good data. And people can put a lot of things, whatever. Do people believe in God? Whatever it is that you can think, oh, this may have some relationship. And what is remarkable is that the results are not very robust, except for a few things, density, even air pollution turned out like I've seen studies where all of a sudden someone simply puts state fixed effects, and then the regression dilutes. So from a statistical point of view, I think it's difficult to go from here. I think from a more micro point of view, as I was saying, we know by age, we know by other medical conditions, we start having things to do a better targeting. But other than that, we can speculate, we can say plausible things. I will just state the result is what we get, and it's still something to be explained.
Thank you. More questions from the audience? More questions? Okay, no more. I think, Martin, you know, we look into the procurement issue also here. I look with our procurement colleagues, procurement during the pandemic. What we saw is, I mean, there were many cases of corruption. I mean, or cases brought to the justice on the premises of corruption during the pandemic. Okay, many of them may be the case. I mean, we don't know. I don't have that information, but many of them, what it reflected is that procurement in Brazil is done through bidding process. It's basically the cheaper ticket. Okay, so and it's very simple. It's very easy. I would say, you know, there's no misunderstanding, but it's highly inadequate for the context in which we were implementing procurement. If you remember, at the worst of the pandemic, the markets didn't work. I mean, people were seizing literally, drugs being shipped from one place to the other. So that led the policymakers and the procurement officers completely lost. And that brought, when we analyzed this in Brazil, that brought this issue of we need to evolve. I mean, this was a waking up call. Okay, I mean, the situation was extreme. We understand that it's not the regular, but there is a certain sense that the private sector procure goods with a market consideration. You know, it's how the market looks like. You know, where do I want to buy? I mean, when we do any of our purchases, this is the things we do. No, we go into Amazon and, you know, which is the one that I want to buy, etc., etc. While here, this restriction is making a huge consequence. Is this something that we can learn going forward? Is there something that, you know, let's get out of this with some lessons learned? No? Is this one of those that you think you are seeing in the region?
It's a very good question. Our analysis was from before the time of COVID. So it referred to the normal purchases of governments of medical supplies and pharmaceuticals. And not all the differences are necessarily corruption. I think I will not jump in that way. But one thing we find is that the private sector is good at understanding the conditions, the supply. So you have a strategic actor on the other side. And when it comes to pharmaceuticals, you don't have many suppliers. For some of these things, you have few suppliers. The thing is, why is that we use this very simple mechanism, like the lowest price gets it, is because more complex mechanisms, which could be superior, could also be manipulated. So if you don't trust, like advanced economies have procurement agencies that negotiate directly with the buyers, you know, come on, this is not your price, give me something better. You don't want to do that in countries where you're not so sure about the integrity of everybody, because the risk is that negotiation will open the gate to worse things. But I would say in places where there is institutional capacity, one could consider better approaches. What we did in this analysis was purely technocratic, like you regress your price on a lot of features of the tender and a lot of features of the market. You see which ones matter and say, I will combine the levels, I could regroup. And as I show, that may give a lot of bargaining power. But when I talk to people who are in procurement at the World Bank, working really in assisting countries, they think that there is a political economy issue that goes beyond the technical issue, that the bigger suppliers to a government have enough influence to block some of these changes. So it's a big agenda. What I will say in this respect is that, to me, one of the areas where one can make progress is these deep trade agreements that introduce discipline on things like procurement, like the EU-Mercosur trade agreement. Like, if we can access procurement in Europe and the Europeans can access procurement in our countries, of course, that will be a transition that will be difficult to manage, but it will bring much more competition and much more discipline, because you will be under the scrutiny of many more players into that. So there are things that we cannot reform domestically because of the vested interest and all that, but sometimes tying our hands through this type of discipline may be a game changer.
Excellent. Any final question from the audience? It's hard to know. These digital seminars are hard to.
I miss real seminars. I wish I could be there.
Martin, final question. What is the next semi-annual? What will be about?
That's a good question. We have 2 candidates at this point. We are not sure. The image is frozen. I'm not sure where you're. No, it's moving.
Yes, you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
So, of course, COVID will continue to be there, but we think that there will be COVID fatigue also. And we have a couple of other subjects, and one that we are very much interested in is the price of electricity. We have a region that has the cleanest energy matrix of all, because we have a lot of hydro, and we have the most expensive electricity of all. Part of it is because we don't have the subsidies that other countries have, although we do have subsidies. But part of it is a lot of distortions, use of electricity as a source of fiscal resources, quasi-fiscal resources, vested interest in sectors that are not reformed in some countries, small scale in others. That means that even if everything goes by the book, there is power by this collusion by generators. And we think that in a region that this is the region that has the greatest potential for electricity trade, because it's not at the level of Europe, but it has already several good networks. And electricity trade is something that is not expensive in terms of infrastructure. It's mainly getting good agreements, getting good agencies, getting enforcement. And so we have, I think, half baked by now report on what are the gains that we could have from cheaper electricity, cleaner electricity across the region. That is one. The other is, of course, digitization. And this is a region, and Brazil in particular, this is a region where there is enormous potential, enormous IT capacity, there are unicorns. So what should we, I spent 6 years in India, and it's fabulous when it comes to the thinking on how to use digital. So what should we be doing? So these are the 2 candidates for now. Seem to have lost your. Can you hear me?
I hear you now. I mean, when you talked about digital, I think this is
the digital.
It's clear that we have a lot of work to do here.
Yes.
A lot of work to do in Brazil. Okay, Martin, thank you. The connection is very unstable. Apologies for that.
Sure, it's not your fault.
But I just wanted to thank you a lot in the names of the.
And thanks to those who participated. Unfortunately, I could not see faces or anything, which is something frustrating about these virtual times. Next time we try to do it in person.
Of course, next time we organize something in person, and we will go over it with a caipirinha. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Martin.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody for attending.